Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of our weekly Exploring the Parasha class with Rabbi Rebecca Schatz and Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
Abraham's servant goes trying to find a wife for Isaac, and we're going to pick up at a pivotal point in that narrative. It's very interesting. It's actually quite a repetitive section of the Parsha, for those who know it, right? We get the narrative of what initially happens, and then we get the servant reciting it to Rivka's family, right? So it's quite... It's a little repetitive. We could go through sort of the nuances of how it's told and not told and all of that kind of stuff. That's not quite where we are going to pick up. As you can tell, I'm having moderate tech issues this morning, but here we go. I will share my screen so you can see the verse that we're going to focus in on. For those who are not seeing what we are all seeing right now, we're in chapter 24, verse 50. So you can hear I'm sort of scrolling relatively quickly through. This is the servant's recitation of what has happened and what has led him to this moment, that he came to the spring. He offered up a prayer to God, that there was this woman who came and fulfilled the prayer that he had asked for, that Rivka came with her jar. She went down to the spring to give him water and to give his camels water. Who are you? She's the daughter of Bethuel. He gave her some jewelry. He knows how to make a girl feel special. He gives thanks to God, and here he is, right? He's now in the tent. He's with Rivka's family, and he's saying, that I'm hoping that your daughter, your sister, will come with me to become my master's wife. Rabbi Schatz and I we're going to focus in on two verses, but we're really just going to focus in on verse 50. But verse 49 sets it up in terms of this turning point. And the servant says, "Ve'ata im yeshchem osim chesed ve'emet et Adoni hagiduli." If you are going to treat my master with true kindness, with chesed ve'emet doesn't really translate. I don't know if that's true, right? With truth and with chesed, with kindness. So you could see true, right? I guess. Ve'im lo hagiduli, and if that's not how it's going to go, then tell me that too. Ve'efne al yamin o al smal, right? Tell me where we're at here. I've given you this whole narrative. Here's where I'm coming from. Here is what the prayer I offered up, how that prayer was fulfilled. I'm hoping she'll come with me. Where do we go from here? Right? And so we're at this turning point in the narrative. And so we're gonna focus in on verse 50 today. I'll zoom in so everyone can see it nice and clear.
It's also interesting that chesed and emet are two of the words that are used when we describe God. Right? Adonai, Rachum, V'chel, right? When we go through that list, chesed ve'emet are in there.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that tees up nicely probably the thing I find most interesting in the verse that we're going to be focusing in on, which is some pretty interesting theological assessments in terms of how all this works. And I'd imagine we're going to explore that a good deal this morning. So here's our verse. Vaya'an Lavan Bethuel vayomru. Lavan and Bethuel answered and said, and we can sort of explore those verbs a little bit. There's some interesting stuff in there. Me'adonai yatsa hadavar. This matter was decreed by God. This matter came from God. And I'll tee up the sense that if you look at the name that they're saying for God, it's the Tetragrammaton, right? Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey. There's some comments about how is it that these guys, these sort of outsiders, know this very special name for God. There's something interesting there. Lo nuchal daber elecha ra otov. Who's to say, right? The servant says, what's going to happen? Who really knows? Who are we to say what is or isn't going to happen here? It's in God's hands. God has decreed it. We cannot speak to you, good, bad, or otherwise. It's out of our hands. obviously the narrative continues from there, but we're going to focus in our attention on that specific verse this morning. Spoiler alert, Rebecca ends up going and marrying Isaac. Hopefully folks know that. But we're going to pause at this sort of uncertain moment in the narrative because there's some interesting stuff to explore. Rabbi Schatz, I don't know if there's any additional context you want to give before we move into Kushiot, but that's the context.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing about the next verse, so you can keep it on for a second.
Yep.
We're not going to focus on it, as Rabbi Shapiro just mentioned, but the verbs that are used are very strong and very straightforward verbs. Hine rivka lefanecha kach velech. So as Rabbi Sean Fieldsmeyer likes to translate hine it as behold, or wow, Rebecca is before you. Take and go. It's not even take her and go or walk nicely with her or take her hand or anything like that. It's take and go. So we leave this moment of kind of theological, maybe not unrest, but confusion. And then we have this moment of like, just leave right now, right? Have it come to the moment where you're going to actually get away from this, from this experience, this moment, by just going. There's no dilly-dallying. You're just going to get up and go. Like a drive-through, Karen Cass said. Sure. Yes. Like taking Rebecca as if she were French fries. All right. So I want to also show you, I'm going to stop sharing your screen for 1 second, Rabbi Shapiro. Okay. I'm definitely going to stop sharing your screen now. All right. I'm going to show you this picture that has nothing to do with our verse, but I do think it's very cute, and I thought of all of you when I saw it. Do you see what it says? Oh, I have to tell the podcast. It says, Abraham, who looks like a very old, wise man sitting at a desk with a book open, says, I must be getting old, Sarah. I can't remember what this week's Parsha is. And she, with her back to him while peeling potatoes, says, story of my life. Get it? Chaye, Sarah.
Ba-dum-bum.
Okay. I thought that was cuter. Oh, some of you are laughing. All right. Very good. So let's look back at the verses. Jay thought it was very cute, so that's fine. We can now end the podcast. Rabbi Shapiro, can you share the verses again, zoomed in?
Yes. My internet is terrible today, so this is going to be a big adventure as you and I continue to be in conversation together.
So far, you're doing great, so we can just keep it up. Great. Yeah. Also, one day you and I should probably listen to this podcast and just listen to how ridiculous we sound. Okay. Nope. So what we have done for the past few weeks and what we would love for you to do is maybe scroll up a little bit so they can see 49 because I think it plays into 50. We're going to ask some kushiot on these two verses, some inquisitive questions, ideas you might have, challenges that you see if you're reading through the Hebrew, words that you might be picking up that are either redundant or used in a specific way, like chesed ve'emet and whatever. So raise your hand. I am going to try to make it so I can see most of you. But yes, if you raise your blue hand like Elon just did, that will be much more helpful. Yeah, Elon, go ahead.
So the two disturbing points of this verse that strike me are, firstly, the matter was decreed by the Lord, right? So there's a question of free will. Mm-hmm. And the subsidiary of that is the second issue, which is if in fact there is no free will because the matter is decreed by the Lord, then there is no accountability, right? We cannot speak to you good or bad. Hey, whatever happens, happens. The Lord God does it. We have no free will, and therefore don't blame us if it turns out badly.
Great, and a lot of the rabbis are going to agree with you that part of what they're saying here, whether or not they can really speak to one side or the other, is kind of null and void. If it's coming from God, then it doesn't matter whether or not we say that was a good idea or a bad idea. It's coming from God. So it just is what it is. I was thinking when reading through that, I'll share this with you afterwards. Okay, Renee, you just have to unmute so we can hear you.
When it says I may turn right or left, first of all, that that connotation for some reason doesn't sit well with me in general because it's too Shoah reminding to me.
Oh, interesting.
But which has nothing to do with the Parsha, but it's just the wording. Mm-hmm. But what does that mean? I may turn right or left. Like, what happens if you turn right, and what happens if you turn left?
Great. There's a lot of directional language in the Torah, and it's very interesting that in this case, it's a matter of choice and how your life is going to pan out if you turn right or you turn left. I had not made the Holocaust connection before, but yeah, I can see how that would be triggering if people are thinking of right and left in those kinds of ways. Denise.
So when it says, the matter was decreed by God, and we're all kind of like, oh yeah, and talking about the implications of that, but where did they even get the idea of God? Because didn't Abraham leave there because they were all into idols, and then later, fast forwarding, like I think Rachel tries to steal the idols when they leave or something. So it just felt weird. Like, where does this God awareness come from, and where was it before, and where did it go later?
That's a great question. A really, really great question. And it plays into this idea that there's no time in the Torah, right? That nothing that happens in chapter 23 means that it actually happened before chapter 27, right? So the fact that I made reference to this last week, the fact that Abraham brings out to those three men who come to his tent meat and milk, the rabbis say, come on, of course he knew about kashrut. That didn't necessarily come before the Ten Commandments. He knew all the laws. So there's this idea of there not being a sense of time. And so where did God come from? Where was God before when they didn't have a sense of God? Where does God go later when there isn't a sense of God again? It's a really, really great theological question. Nora.
Unmute. Okay. So since I'm, before today, I read it from a different source, the Chabad.org.
Yeah.
And someone brought up the, free will and decree. And in the Chabad translation, it says emanate and not decree, which gives a whole, difference. So again, I always come with the word interpretation. So I'm curious from the Hebrew, which has the closer leaning, because I think that also affects, decree has more of a legal aspect to it and a little bit more hard, whereas emanate, it's like it just came from God and may lend to the free will question also.
Yeah, it also just shows that every interpretation is its own commentary. The words that Rabbi Shapiro mentioned that he's going to go into a little bit later are the words vaya'an and vayomru, which basically just mean answer and say. So neither of them mean decree and neither of them mean emanate, but they're both used.
I think she's referring to Me'adonai Yatsa Hadavar, right? That the matter was decreed by the Lord. And Noora, to your point, I think the Chabad translation is closer to the pshat of the text, right? Because Yatsa means goes out, right? It's not siva, right? It's not God commanded the matter. Yeah. It's Ma'adonai Yatsa Davar. This matter came from God. This matter emanated from God. I think, as Rabbi Schatz said, yes, translation is always interpretation. And there's some interesting stuff to play with in terms of what some other sources indicate about, I'll say, God and matchmaking. There's a midrash that I'm very excited to share a little bit later, on. But I think in terms of the pshat, I think that Chabad translation is probably closer to that sort of original.
Thanks for the correction.
Hebrew word.
Yeah, thank you for the correction. Yeah, for sure. If it comes from that word, it definitely is closer. Yeah, Nancy.
So reading how strong this is, that whether the matter was decreed or emanated by the Lord, it makes it sound like there are no decisions, which makes it sound like this Parsha was written by two different people. Because later on, not what happened. It isn't just, it's decreed so we can do nothing. Rebecca, right, actually gets asked. So that's confusing.
Yeah, great. Yeah, different kinds of interpretations of the same story in terms of what they're feeling or how they're looking on to the experience versus what actually happens later. And is that two different authors, or is it just two different, viewpoints onto the same scenario? Yeah, Rebecca. That's a lot of Rebecca talk today. Me, you, the Parsha.
Okay. I started talking and I was still muted. So reading through it 2 or 3 times, I see that so are you going to do, right by me or whatever way you translate that or not? And then there's turn right or left. And then we can't say bad or good. And it and reading through it over and over again, I have my question is whether yamin or small, meaning right or left, are equivalent, or is yamin referring to if you say yes, and small is if you say no, and ra is for small and tov is for yamin, So I'm wondering if yamin or small here are two different behaviors based on the answer, rather than I'll just go.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't remember which commentary it is, but I'm going to bring it up later, that there is this idea that Ra does stand for one thing in her future life, and that Tov stands for another thing. So it's possible that Yamin and Small also take those same midrashic approaches. This rabbi will only be talking about Ra and Tov, but you're picking up on a really interesting reflection within these two verses. Jay.
I was going to ask, I know it's sort of related to this, but how old was Rebecca in this?
Oh, we don't know. So I actually spoke on this last night or yesterday morning. For those of you who are with me for Midrasha, I spoke about how in the Torah it is written Na'ar, which is the form for saying young boy, actually in today's modern day Hebrew, but it's written with the voweling of modern day with a kamatz underneath. So it says Na'ar. If you read it, it's supposed to sound like Na'ara. But in the actual text, it's Na'ar, which if you're interested, I can tell you where that comes up. So that we don't know how old she is, like in years. Though if the Torah gave us years, we also wouldn't be sure how old she was. But she was young. She was known as probably a teenager, not an adult. Which is how she's depicted in her description. Yeah. Are
you asking that because you're curious about agency for her? Is that what's prompting the question there?
Just, her rights and how she felt about this.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And later on, when we actually see the story of Rebecca unfold, we see that whether or not she was old or young, she felt a lot of agency, and she felt like she really could speak her mind. And in fact, her family uplifted her to be able to do so. But yeah, it's a great point. Renee.
I was curious about back to the left and right that I was curious about. I looked up in Rashi, and it says scripture always arranges directions with reference to one facing east. So north is called left and south is called right. Abraham lived in Hebron, and Lot lived in the north left in the Dead Sea area, and Ishmael was in the south, the right, in the desert of Paran. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's how they were measuring whether to turn right or left.
And I think there's a practical component there too, right? That they're looking for someone who's not in the nuclear family, but they are looking for a relative as a spouse. Rabbi Schatz and I were talking about this earlier this week, that Yitzchak and Rivka are related, right? And so the right or left there is not just identifying in terms of this is Rashi's interpretation of those words, right? But that looking for someone else in the family, right? Whether it's from Lot or from Yishmael, right? If this isn't going to work out, all right, well, those are the next spots on the find a wife for Yitzchak train, right? That's sort of potentially going to be the next move, which is interesting.
I don't see any other hands, I don't think. Do you, Rabbi Shapiro? No. Okay. All right. So I'm going to share my screen because you all seem to like being able to see the sources I'm referring to. So I'm going to show you. Okay. So I'm going to show you this one first. So when we're talking here about, so here's the verse here. Yatsa hadavar. So this is the same part that Neora asked a question about, and Rabbi Shapiro responded correctly. So what we're talking about here is that this somehow originated or came from or emanated or was decreed by God. Lavan meant that it was evident from the order in which matters had occurred that a higher power was involved here. They acknowledged that matchmaking was a preserve of celestial forces. In Sota, in the Gemara, it states that 40 days prior to the development of the fetus, a heavenly voice proclaims that the daughter of so-and-so will be married to so-and-so, even if the two people involved live on opposite sides of the ocean. Okay, it's also brought up in Proverbs, in a different place. Clearly, parents are only able to bequeath you material riches, whereas only God can provide you with the soulmate you crave. Parents are unable to bequeath you the proper wife. In a manner of speaking, such sentiments are also reflected in Solomon's famous poem about the woman of valor, Eshet Chayil. So I'm just going to scroll down to the bottom here, though I'm happy to send this to you if you want to read the whole thing. Sorry, hold on. I have to find where it starts.
Schatz, can I toss in the midrash that I referenced, since I think it gives sort of like a different.
Yeah, you're frozen. Let me just finish this, and then you can
like narrative-ish take.
Yes, let me just.
Did you want to keep? You can keep going.
Okay. You just cut out, so I kept going. The reason that the Talmud did not phrase the statement simply Ploni el Ploni, right, person to person, was to show that the statement is not to be taken literally, but that it applies to the relationships between different spiritual concepts. Such concepts to exist in a form of marriage to one another. This is also why the sages in the Talmud mentioned the female before the male. Okay. So what I wanted to bring up here is similar to actually Elon's frustration at the beginning, was that there is this concept of marriage not being something that we as people can even speak to. And I didn't know this as midrash or as even like Jewish thought until I was researching this verse. That, yes, more Jewish mysticism for Rebecca Schatz. Very good. That this is something that people actually believe, that people believe that when you are born, similar to, I think, the secular concept of a soulmate, right? Or the idea of a beshert, that there is someone who is meant to be your partner. And however you find that person is your story, but that person was set out to be your person from conception. And I wouldn't say that I believe that as a person and as a thinker, but it does bring God into this partnership in a very powerful and some could say troubling and challenging way. That if Rebecca were to end up with someone else, would that person not be as good, right? What if they had a better marriage and a better future than she and Isaac end up having, right? What does that say about the partnership that you choose to be in? So I just wanted to bring that up because I wonder, first of all, if people have comments on that, but also how that sits with people, because I do think that's the general kind of understanding of our rabbis in the comments that they have on this part. And I know that Rabbi Shapiro is going to bring in a midrash that brings the point even further into narrative, if he can be heard. And so Rabbi Shapiro, why don't you share, and then we can see if people have questions on the concept.
Sure. I'll foreground it by sort of addressing the general concept and then sharing the midrash itself, which is, the concept of things being sort of, to go with the original translation that we were exploring, the idea of things being decreed and all of the attendant challenges it raises that I think Elon was naming right from the outset in terms of accountability and, ownership over one's actions instead of just saying like, oh, it's in God's hands, is very troubling for me. I'll also say, the concept of recognizing how much is out of our control and trying to be an acceptance of that while also not letting ourselves off the hook for the things that we can take action on is challenge, right? What's the right balance there? I think it's a really big question. There's a midrash that I love about this concept of matchmaking specifically. I think some of the Rabbeinu Bachia teaching was referencing this at least implicitly because it's from Breshit Rabbah, which I'm sure Rabbeinu Bachia knew. Just give it to you in English. It's a nice little narrative. So here we go. A Roman woman asked Rabbi Yossi, "In how many days did God create the world?" "In 6, he answered. Since then, she asked, "What has God been doing?" A fair question, right? God's been around for a while. What has God been up to? "Matching couples for marriage," responded Rabbi Yossi. "That's it?" she said dismissively. "Even I can do that. I have many slaves, male and female. In no time at all, I can match them for marriage." Very heteronormative. We can get into that later. To which Rabbi Yossi countered, "Though this may be an easy thing for you to do, for God it is as difficult as splitting the Red Sea." All right, how do we think our Roman woman is going to do? Not so great. She took her leave. Did I cut out again? Nope, great. Whereupon she took her leave the next day. She lined up 1,000 male slaves, 1,000 female slaves, paired them off before nightfall. The morning after, her estate resembled a battlefield. One slave had his head bashed in. Another had lost an eye, while a third hobbled because of a broken leg. Things went bad real quick. No one seemed to want his or her assigned mate. Quickly she summoned Rabbi Yossi and acknowledged, "Your God is unique, and your Torah is true, pleasing and praiseworthy. You spoke wisely." It's a fascinating story. There's a lot to unpack in there. But I think just to name out the implicit theological concept and to speak to it personally, right, the sense there is that it's really hard to figure out who goes with who, right? That it's not as simple as just slapping people together and say, you with you, right? Joe with Joanne and Tony with Antonia, and you guys go together and Shabbat Shalom and it's going to be great, right? That it takes some skill and some nuance. I would add into that relationships take work, period, right? That I also feel agnostic at best about the idea of a single soulmate. I think relationships take work, and we each need to put the work into our relationships of all kinds, romantic or otherwise, to sustain them. I'll also say Renee messaged me privately. She said, "Does that mean you don't believe in things being beshert?" That's a big question, Renee. I will say one of the ways in which I have felt God's hand very much in my life is how I met Sarah. For those of you who don't know, I was but a young prospective rabbinical student visiting both New York and Los Angeles, and I met Sarah, like any good prospective rabbinical student, at Minyan, the first morning I was ever in Los Angeles, and things just sort of went from there, right? It could have gone so many different ways. And you could attribute that to chance. You could attribute that to that's just how things happen. You could attribute that to I made choices and that's how that's unfolded. But I feel something bigger than me in that, right? I feel that in that relationship.
Or the beshert.
You could potentially call it that, as Renee is. BJ, yeah.
Well, certainly in the Parsha, this is not constructed as some chance encounter, right? That there's divine hand at work in this whole episode, right? That the servants are saying, okay, we're going to set up this test, right? I'm going to stand by this well and ask the first lady, ask each girl that comes by for water. I'm going to wait for the one that draws it for me and my camels. Boom, 2 seconds later, girl walks up, first one out of the gate, offers water. it says, right, scarcely had I finished my prayer or something, Rebecca walks up, hey, can I have some water? Yeah, how would I get some for your camels too? Right? So this is not a chance encounter. There is the work of God here, you have to think, right? And that this was going to be what was going to be happening. This was divinely sort of chosen as a path, and this was set up so humans would understand it, but this was not just a chance encounter. So,
and what's interesting to me about like the Midrash inverts that, right? The Midrash says, and if you don't go with that, look out, right? That things can really go awry, and in some ways, I guess in my head, I see the scene as comical because it feels so over the top. But in thinking about it further, it's a disturbing image, right? That there can be violence that comes out of relationships that go awry, right? It's not, right? That can be a really traumatic and painful thing for people when a relationship doesn't work. Or to put it one step further, there are relationships that people stay in because either implicitly or explicitly they're being told, you need to stay in that relationship. You made that commitment, like it or not, you're in that relationship, right? So the inverse of that can also be really troubling. Nora put in the chat an interesting comment, right? Maybe our Besherets aren't people that it'll pan out whether we work at it or not, but the people we have the most powerful potential with when we do work at it, right? So a sense of partnership there, right? It's not all one or all the other, but there's the people who we are kind of drawn to, who we feel implicit connections with automatically, and then having the opportunity to build and work at those relationships. So it's not as black or white.
Does anybody have any thoughts about either of the pieces that were just brought? The commentary of the Midrash, before we take kind of a different angle on this? No? Okay. So one of the things that this is where I was about to say this when I was talking to Elon, and then I stopped myself, and I'll share it here. One of the things that I am struck by in this verse is the fact that a person in relationship with God does not feel like one can criticize or say something good or bad. That either way, that it's in God's hands, and so it doesn't matter what I say, because it's just going to be decided. And so that's it, and I shouldn't respond. Now, it strikes me for a few reasons. Number one, because it's not how Rebecca interacts with this scenario at all moving forward. She doesn't share so many words, but she does have a say, and she does say something. And so in that, right, we see that, in fact, it does matter that you have feelings about something, or in this case, someone, and that you share them, even if God is involved. And I, at least in my theology, I think that it is, I think that it is good, and I think that it is healthy to be in a relationship with God where you can not only challenge that which you might feel or believe, but also be able to insert yourself in that relationship. So whether you're a person who prays, or you're a person who just speaks to God as if God is a character in your home, or if you're a person who doesn't believe in God at all, but recognizes that things in nature are happening, and the way that humans are dealing with the world is either positive or negative, depending on the day. And so dealing with that in a way that we don't just see it as a guy sitting in a chair upstairs that we have nothing to do with, is at least the way that I interact with the world, that I want to make sure that I feel like I have some say and some interaction with how things are going for me in my life and for the life of the community that I put myself in. The other thing that I'll say is to bring it out of God language for a second and just into human life, is that if any of us work with people who are above us, right, whether or not we are high up in our positions and it's one person, or we are the top, there's always someone or something who you're going to feel like you are responding to, right? Even CEOs feel as though there is someone that they are responding to, no matter how that food chain works itself out. If something is happening in your organization, let's just use that word so it's across the board. If something is happening in your line of work in that organization, and the person at the top decides we are going to do something, I have decided this is what's happening, and you don't agree, then what happens when it's just decided that that's going to be what takes place, right? Do you share your opinions? Do you say, this is how I feel, this is how this is making me feel? Or do you just recognize that there's someone higher up than you who's going to make those decisions? And to me, that's how this verse reads. This verse reads as, there is someone higher up than myself. And so whether I say something good or bad doesn't really matter, because it's already been decided by the person who has the power. In this case, God. So I want to read one commentary that speaks to exactly what I'm bringing up here. And it says, it's Rashi. And the part of the verse that says, Lo nuchal davar elecha, we can't say anything to you, refusing this proposition either by answering you with unpleasant words or by giving you a reasoned reply. For it is evident that the matter that comes before you from God is according to your statement that God brought her and you together. So whether I think this is a good shidduch or not, doesn't really matter. God brought you together. That's how it's going to go. So I really love, and this isn't in our verse, but I really love that Rebecca's job later on is to insert herself, is to use her voice. Because we see that even if they were not able to use their voices in that powerful way, that somehow she comes about and uses her voice. I have one more piece, but I want to flip it over to Rabbi Shapiro if he wants to comment on that, and then we can move to the last piece.
I don't have a specific comment on that Rashi. I'm just sort of internally wrestling. I guess I'm no longer internally wrestling. I'm talking out loud. Wrestling with, I'll offer it up like this. Folks know I worked at Beit Tshuva for a while. There's a reading in the big book and like the core text of Alcoholics Anonymous. It talks about acceptance is the answer to all my problems today, right? That when I see things happening in the world that I want to control, that don't seem like they're going my way, that the challenge of coming to acceptance of those things. And again, there's sort of that dance that we're referring to of being in acceptance of what's happening around us and saying, okay, there are just things that are out of my control, and still having agency. And Rabbi Schatz, I think you're referring to that in terms of Lavan and Bethuel saying this isn't really in our hands, and then Rivka exercising that agency. It's interesting in that regard. There's nobody picked up on it when we were doing Kushiot, but the verbs at the beginning of verse 50 are interesting because it's Vaya'an Lavan uVethuel vayomru, right? Lavan answered and Lavan and Bethuel said, right? Like there's a singular and then there's a plural verb there, right? So they're like sort of talking over each other to then both say, it's out of our hands. We can't really do anything, which is interesting. But, then I also think about the serenity prayer, right? God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, acceptance, the courage to change the things I can. I have some agency and the wisdom to know the difference, right? It seems like there's a sense that Rivka has been chosen, and Lavan and Bethuel are then kind of saying, okay, that doesn't really seem like it's up to us. But I'll highlight again that in that verse, the fact that they use that really holy name of God, right? The holiest name of God, and how can they possibly have known that name, which there were questions about earlier. I found an interesting piece exploring that a bit, but Rabbi Schatz, I don't know if you want to toss one more piece in the hopper before that.
Sure. I was just reading through the piece to decide if I wanted to share the whole thing, and I'm not going to. I'm just going to share it with you. I'm going to share with you. Everything's okay. I'm going to share with you kind of what
dropping
the
stuff.
punchline is. I dropped something. Sorry.
Breaking things.
So the punchline is that this bad and good, back to Rebecca's point, the bad and good are seen by this commentary, the Shnei Luchot Abrit, which I think I actually brought last time, is saying that bad is in regard to Esav and good is in regard to Jacob. And that they can't speak to how, remember later on, Rebecca receives a blessing. they can't speak to later on whether or not this is the right move, because there will from her be both bad and good. But this idea that there is something that comes from her that has both. So it's not all good, it's not all bad, but it's this challenge of understanding that from your relationship, Rebecca and Isaac, you in what you're going to produce will be both good and bad. So if the two of them had spoken to this relationship that's about to come together, how could they say anything good or bad when it's going to result in so much goodness and so much not such goodness? So that's how they describe what the bad and good is here, which I really like, because it also takes the kind of the weight and the responsibility off of whether or not we believe that God really decreed this. I like that it's about what we put out into the world, and that our relationships have consequences, both some good and some bad. So anyway, Rebecca, I want to bring that to answer the good and bad question, and just to leave that as a non-theological response to this very theologically based sentence here.
There's another piece I saw that's also non-theological, more linguistic, but harkens back to a phrase that I'm sure many of you will recognize as well. In the Eitz Chaim, they make the comment that in the Torah, saying two opposites indicates a totality, right? So saying tov v'ra indicates everything running the gamut, right? Not a 10 on the good scale, not a 10 on the bad scale, but that and everything in between. And the reference they make is back to Gan Eden, which is right, when they say Etz Hada'at Tov V'Ra, right? That when they ate from that tree, they weren't just learning what was super good and what was super bad. They were learning those two poles and everything in between as well. So in some ways, through that statement, they're saying we can say even less, right? We can't say anything at all, but that it's less about we give 2 thumbs up or 2 thumbs down on this. It's that this seems to be something that's just sort of out of our understanding, stam, like just generally.
But also, and it's sorry, this is something that we haven't spoken about a lot, but what you just said made me think about the result of the words that could have been said, could have been heard as bad or good, right? Lashon hara, I'm sure many of you know this. Lashon hara is not just saying bad things about someone behind their back. It's saying anything behind someone's back, because even good things, if I say to BJ, it's just fun to pick on BJ. If I say to BJ, I really love Neora, right? And BJ says back to me, oh, really? I heard that there was this one thing that happened this one time. I know they don't know each other, which is why I chose them. Right. So this idea that it's not just that they could have said something, but it's what could have been perceived from their words, which is goes back to the Gan Eden piece, because we didn't know what was good and what was bad. And had they said something that they might have meant as good, it might have come across as bad. I hadn't thought about that, but I like that it's not necessarily the words that they would have spoken, but it's the way in which we, or the present company, would have understood the words that they would have shared. You said you had a piece you wanted to share.
I did. I was seeing if other people had said. I'm talking a lot. I wanted to see if anybody else had anything they want to share. We got Nancy. We got Gary. Karen's been quiet. I want to see if other folks want to say, but that's okay. The piece I'll add. So do folks know who Nechama Leibovitz is? Folks know Nechama Leibovitz? So always fantastic. It's always a jackpot when you're looking at a verse, and it turns out there's like a whole Nechama Leibovitz essay on that verse, because she weaves no, Karen, that's the Bedside Torah by Rabbi Brad Artson, but that's a different book, but also good. So it's always a jackpot when. Why are you making faces, Karen? What happened? I can't hear you at all. But, okay.
He's typing it. You can show the book
again. Oh, show the book again. Yes. Oh, both of us. Here, I'll spotlight. There we go. Spotlight for everyone. There we go. Very good. Yeah, very good. Thank you, Vanna. Okay. So, Bonnie. Let's see, Bonnie. There we go. Oh,
there's also, there's also Nechama Leibovitz.
Yeah.
Wow.
Probably, yeah, very good. Okay. Thus ends the show and tell portion of our program.
I'll do it.
Good. Yes.
Hey, Rabbi Shapiro, where did you go?
Again.
No, you're back. You're back.
Okay. Something is awry.
Now you're back. Keep going. Go.
Am I back?
Yes, go fast.
Great. Okay, fantastic. Very good. It's always, oh man, always good when you have Nechama Leibovitz. She weaves together so many pieces together so beautifully. And what she picks up on in this specific verse is she highlights a back and forth, what she sees as a back and forth between Rashi and Ramban in terms of a phrase within the verse. This one that we've been playing with a bit, that the matter emanated from was decreed by God, because she points out that oftentimes when a phrase like that is said in Torah, Rashi, who always wants to sort of see how the different pieces are connected, wants to explore, like, okay, so it's saying that came from God, but where could we have seen that earlier or even later on in the narrative, right? What's the internal proof within the Torah that this is really something that emanated from God? And he doesn't do that. He doesn't do this in this verse. And then Ramban says, well, you know what? Sometimes a phrase is just a phrase, right? You don't necessarily need to connect it one thing all the way over to the other thing. He says sometimes a phrase is just a phrase. And Nechama Leibovitz gives like sort of an interesting next level gloss on that. She makes a really interesting point in terms of potentially how we ourselves can experience the world and God within the world. She writes, there's no need of texts or mysterious divine voices. Right? We don't need to connect one verse to another. You don't need to know exactly where it comes from. The truly perceptive and understanding person catches the word of God in the everyday round of events and the fate of individuals and people, which I think is really beautiful and subversive within the Torah, and still challenging and beautiful, right? Beautiful because I think it's a beautiful sentiment. Subversive insofar as a lot of the Mefarshim go out of their way, and understandably so, given what we know about Lavan later on and how he interacts with Yaakov, etc., go out of their way to portray Bethuel and Lavan, particularly Lavan, as bad, right? So Nechama's comment is particularly subversive in that she's saying, by virtue of the fact that they're seeing God in this happening, they're actually quite perceptive and understanding, right? Which is an interesting subversion of the sense that they're bad, they don't know what they're talking about, they're not taking ownership, that they're actually able to access something bigger than them in this moment, which is really interesting. Still challenging in terms of trying to see fate, or she uses that word fate, although she writes in Hebrew, so I don't know what the Hebrew word is there. Maybe Bonnie has it, right? But the sense that there is something bigger than us. But again, I do think it's theologically challenging and potentially powerful to think about where in my life, where in our lives do we see, if you want to go anthropomorphic with it, the hand of God? Where in our lives do we experience something bigger than us? And how do we see that unfolding? It's a challenging question. And I think it's an important question and certainly a thought-provoking one. Yeah, Ilan.
Yeah, I would actually posit that the fact that they acknowledge God's existence or God's intervention in this sentence and then subsequently go on to behave in a bad way actually makes it worse. Because to the extent that they are ignorant, it's fine to say, well, listen, these guys had no clue who it is. But the fact that actually they should have known better, to me, makes it far worse.
So the fact that they, it seems like, even have one moment where they have a glimmer of seeing that operating in the world, and that later on Lavan in particular acts so poorly, reflects even worse on him, is what you're saying, yeah? and also in some ways, I think, potentially relatable, right? I've had moments where I've felt very connected to something bigger than me. I've had moments where I have not been my best, right? There's always that push.
It's almost like the political, I hate to bring politics into it, but many people will say, well, Donald Trump is what he is, and he's just a buffoon and doesn't know any better, but all these Republicans who should know better are enabling him, whatever, and actually what the people who know better but don't do anything about it are actually worse.
I'm going to go right over to Naora on that.
I might be jumping here, but I really wanted to bring up a different tone to the, where is it? We cannot speak to either good, bad or good. My first reaction to that actually wasn't so much that I didn't think about it that way, that we can't challenge, but my first reaction was that they have so much faith that they can just trust the, what God says. And number two, they might have a lot of intense emotions about Rivka going. And sometimes it's a lot easier to deal with those emotions when you don't have a choice, kind of. So when an authority figure makes a hard line, sometimes it could be a relief, like, oh, I don't have to make a decision here on something very major. Confusion can be like the worst feeling sometimes. So sometimes when an authority figure gives you a hard line and decision, sometimes it's a relief. So just one way to think about it.
Yeah. I appreciate that as kind of a closing statement, right? That we can think about the ways in which this speaks to us as giving us power to sometimes say more or do more, or also just sit in the fact that sometimes we have to take a deep breath and say, okay, this is out of my hands. There is literally nothing else I can do, nothing else I can say that will make this positive. So I'm just going to let it be. And letting it be is really, really hard, especially if it's something that you strongly believe in. And I think that there is, when we talk about this particular moment in hearing the bad or the good, that also emotions, when you're very emotional about something, you can have the best intentions, and the way in which you say something can come across as derogatory or challenging or not the way in which you mean it, because you're passionate and you're frustrated. And so it comes across as bad when it was meant to come across as good and enamored with something. So I hope that you, first of all, I think both Rabbi Shapiro and I always hope that what this class does is allow you to focus in on a Parsha deeply that you might have just glossed over. So I hope that happened for you again today, and that you can now read the rest of the Parsha through the lens of this being a major starting point. But also for all of us to think about, where are the moments that we are too passive, that we need to say, actually, I have a voice in this and I need to say something? And when are the moments that we maybe say too much, or we overstay our welcome in terms of the things that we have tried to do to make it change and it's just not changing? And do we just take a deep breath and say, okay, someone else is now in charge of this, and just as Naora just said, allow that to be okay and allow it to just be. So I hope that this is a Shabbos of allowing yourself to just be, and appreciate the peace that is Shabbat without needing to check a TV for an election result, and just have a Shabbat Shalom, and hope to see you sometime soon.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.